morning, Professor Grosse, and thank you very much for taking the time to meet us. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. To begin, could you please introduce yourself and briefly outline your professional background?
My name is Daniel Gross. I'm a professor of practice here at the university, and I work in particular for the Institute for European Policy Making, which is a sort of in-house think tank here in Bocconi. I have a long professional life beforehand in Brussels. For 37 years I was in the think tank world in Brussels, also at times working for the European Union on projects like the introduction of the euro. And my own training is that of an economist with a PhD from the University of Chicago.
The global economic environment is becoming increasingly fragmented. How is it changing the way Europe approach economic policy?
I would say that the fragmentation of the global economic environment is perhaps exaggerated. If one looks at the flows of trade, they're continuing more or less as before, with one exception, trade between the United States and China. Global investment, international investment, foreign direct investment has also held up pretty well. So I think what we are seeing is a lot of noise, a lot of political noise, and of course some underlying tensions. But for the time being, these political tensions have not yet affected most of business. There are some areas where politics intrudes, but I would say still perhaps 90% of global trade and investment has been little affected by political tensions.
To what extent is the European Union able to act strategically in today's geopolitical context compared to the major power like the United States and China?
Of course, the European Union doesn't have the political unity that China or the US have. And sometimes I'm asking myself whether it is good or bad. Of course, those who think in terms of political power, they think it's better to have one big actor that can act decisively. But politics is very different from economics. In politics, power is a zero-sum game. I have more, you have less. And the bigger I am, the smaller relative to me you are. In economics, it's usually a positive sum game. So we both gain when we trade, because we wouldn't trade otherwise, right? We both gain from direct investment. Again, it wouldn't happen if it weren't for mutual benefit. And that's why sometimes what is sold as being geopolitical strong doesn't make economic sense. And here the lack of unity within the EU helps at times, because economic sensible actions are more likely to be undertaken, and economically, say, dangerous or useless actions like high tariffs, for example, are less likely to be adopted in the European Union context. So, less strong politically, but perhaps it's actually better for our economy.
Okay, and considering that, how do geopolitical tensions influence key economic variables as inflation, interest rates, and exchange rates in Europe?
We are seeing now with the war in the Gulf that actually the impact of geopolitical tensions on these macro variables has been very limited. Growth rates might now go down a bit if the conflict continues. Inflation might go up, but we are talking here about 0.5% more on inflation, 0.5% less on growth, nothing earth-shattering. So yes, in these extreme scenarios of war, there is some influence, but it's actually limited. If you think about the China-US geopolitical tensions, they have had almost zero impact on inflation or growth rates. So I would say we shouldn't overestimate the impact of geopolitical tensions on the economy.
Good point. And Europe has traditionally relied on open markets. Is this model still sustainable in a more protectionist and security-driven world?
I would say very much so, because we know since Adam Smith's time that becoming protectionist doesn't help the economy. It has very high economic costs. And so if the others, as Adam Smith said, if the others put sand in their harbors to impede trade, it doesn't make sense that we do the same. So I think we shouldn't imitate, certainly not the mistakes of Donald Trump in the United States. If the others become protectionist, that might hurt us a bit, but that's 90% their problem. And it doesn't make absolutely sense to do the same thing as them. And therefore I would say the open trade approach very much is in the EU's interest, not because everybody does it, but because it's in our interest, whatever the others do.
And what are the main vulnerabilities of the Europe economy from a geopolitical perspective today?
One vulnerability is clear these days, that is Europe depends on energy sources from abroad, right, oil and gas, and there is very little we can do to change that quickly. The green transition, of course, will slowly diminish that dependency, but very slowly. It will take 10, 15 years. There's no quick fix to the short-term dependency on imported oil and gas. The only thing we can do is diversify our sources, not depend all on one. And then there's a second point which is much more difficult to deal with, which is the lack of a strong let's say, high-tech sector in Europe, and we see that especially now with artificial intelligence. And that's something which, again, is very difficult to deal with because you don't create a strong AI sector from zero. And it's not something that the government can push a button, AI sector now please grow. It has to come from the economic environment, and that doesn't seem to be conducive in Europe to create such a sector. And I think that will remain a vulnerability for quite some time.
So how should European institutions balance economic efficiency with strategic autonomy?
I think the implicit trade-off in that question is wrong. In almost all cases, I would say, economic efficiency is actually what will ensure in the long term our security and our autonomy. Now, there might be some small areas where the European level might intervene, but I think they are the exceptions rather than the rule. And in most cases, it is better to have a strong domestic economy, because the stronger our own domestic economy, the more maybe we develop technologies, which then on which the rest of the world is dependent. So instead of saying we have to do everything that the rest of the world maybe has as a choke point towards us, we should think about, can we develop our own strengths so that we have choke points towards the rest of the world?
From your experience advising governments and institutions, how much do policymakers actually incorporate geopolitical considerations into economic decisions?
I would say they are doing that increasingly today, but they are doing that in a way that, in my view, is not efficient. Not only not efficient in terms of economics, but also not efficient in terms of the goals they want to achieve. And the second point is that, of course, the incumbents, the existing industry, uses the arguments of strategic autonomy and security to foster their own interests. So the car industry comes and says, we are a strategic sector indispensable for European autonomy. You must give us more subsidies. The semiconductor sector comes the same thing. We must get more subsidies. But then if you give out subsidies left and right, at the end what you end up with is an industry where you always subsidize the losers, and that's not a way to have a strong economy, because a strong economy with a strong high-tech sector is the ultimate guarantee of strategic autonomy.
And looking at a recent crisis, from the Eurozone crisis to energy shocks, what lessons has Europe learned about resilience?
Well, it has learned that from time to time we in Europe depend on the supply of certain inputs. But maybe the wrong lesson has been learned, in the sense that saying, okay, now we have to make sure that these inputs are being produced in Europe. And maybe what we should have learned is that we have to become more resilient in general. But more resilient in general means perhaps having some stockpiles, but it also means different things. If we want our economy to become, and our political systems to become more resilient, one key point, for example, would be to have low public debt. Because if you have low public debt, then in a crisis, the government can intervene a lot. If you have already high public debt, like this country here, a crisis comes along, you're stuck. Right? So that's just one example of the ways in which you can foster economic resilience, but not by intervening in specific economic sectors, but by making the entire system ready so that it can actually react to shocks.
And lastly, in your view, what are the most important economic risks for Europe in the next 5-10 years?
I mean, the one risk we see today is, again, energy prices, although I think their importance is being exaggerated. I would say the biggest risk is that there are two risks. One is domestic politics, that we slide in a situation where we protect our industries that do not perform well. So if we protect the losers, in the end, we go into an area where we have less and less growth, more protectionism, and so on. The second point is, a second danger is somewhat connected, which is that the artificial intelligence is becoming more and more important economically, but also politically, also in the military field. And we risk that we are falling further behind, because our regulation in Europe, for example, centering about things that are desirable but just not implementable, like human-centered artificial intelligence, our limitations on the use of data, and so on, they risk putting European industry further back in this crucial economic and technological field.
Thank you very much, Professor Gross, for your time and for sharing your valuable insight with us. We truly appreciate your contribution.
My pleasure.